The Ragman, written by Paul Breen Jr., read by Cider Crusader. He's waiting, he's watching, he's biding his time. He stares as you're sleeping. It's just after 9. You're holding your blanket in comfortable heaven. He's sneaking towards you. The clock says 11. You dream about candy and chocolate and fun. He's nearly beside you. It's just turning 1. You don't see him coming. There's no time to flee. You wake up. You scream. It's his time. It's 3. Old Children's Tale, The Ragman. I've always had a keen interest in horror. Ever since I was a young boy, my friend Richard and I used to sneak into his living room at night when I'd stay over. We'd stick on whatever scary film we could find on VHS, or we'd turn on the TV and watch one that we'd spot on the TV guide. I remember watching the movie Halloween when I was roughly 12. It terrified me, sent chills up my spine, and made me peek over my shoulder for the next week, but it did intrigue me. I kept lapping up all the ghost stories and horror tales that I could get my hands on. I watched The Exorcist when I was 14 and it freaked the hell out of me. I didn't sleep for about a month, I'd say. And that was also roughly around the time that I discovered the delights of Stephen King and James Herbert novels. Nerve-shredding chills on every page. And there was just so many of them that I could barely have time to read them all. No matter how old I got, no matter how mature I became, I never lost that spirit. That need to be frightened by a horror story or movie, that desire to feel terrified. It's probably why I turned to writing horror myself. I just wanted to give someone else that thrill I'd been seeking all throughout my adolescence. In time, I unfortunately grew desensitized to scary movies and books. It's part of growing up. The feeling of fear when watching a terrifying movie alone with the lights off began to get diluted as I became older, and I began looking for bigger and better scares. Searching for ghost stories or other tales of dread that people had told me were real became the next big thing. Not the stories that you might see on the TV screen and then switch off and simply try to forget. Not the tale in the pages of a book that escaped from shutting it. I went from town to town and all over the web, hearing about all the ramblings of the paranoid and the true believers, and after years of searching, I found something. That experience with the truly macabre, that came with the chill up my spine, the peeking over my shoulder, the difficulty of sleeping simply by knowing it. The most disturbing and heart-wrenching, fear-inducing tale of menace that I had ever heard. Well, to be honest, I am a little biased, and I'll tell you why. It's simple. It happened to me. And here's my account with the entity known as the Ragman. In my home, you could find all sorts of horror paraphernalia. Old books, haunted dolls, crucifixes used during real exorcisms, and just about every scary movie you could possibly mention. Give me a thunderstorm and a camera and I could give you a truly terrifying scene by simply filming any part of my house. Still, everybody has their vices. Mine was something I was proud of. It had become difficult to meet women though. Most of them couldn't stay in my house too long, and it's no wonder why. There just simply isn't enough cushions in the world to block out your sight from that much frightening imagery. That's just the way that I am, however, and say what you want about me. I don't change to suit someone else. That's a trait I find to be a rare quality. Now, let me start the tale of the Ragman by giving you a little history lesson in folklore. While you may not be aware of it, the story's been around for centuries. Supposedly, it was taken up by the Grimm's brother at some stage and became a fairy tale of sorts. This, of course, was back in the time that all fairy tales were darker and more chilling. Back in the day when Disney didn't own the rights to them. When they had a more sinister effect on the imagination. Eventually, it was forgotten, as its details were known to be too grim, excuse the pun, for a child's bedtime story. Parents refused to tell the story to their kids, and it was lost over time. If you ask me, they were right to. I had never heard of the story in all my years of researching tales of terror. But that changed on the evening of November 12th, the date I received a painting. It was a morning like all others. Nothing special or noteworthy about it. Therefore, I'll try not to bore you with the unimportant details of exactly what happened in work and get right into the story. I went to work, as I always do every weekday, for 8 hours in the planning and payroll section of the local authority's office, sorting out invoices for local businesses and decades-old planning files. Boring work, basically, and like all other days, I was glad and exhausted when the clock said 5. I immediately went home, eager to get online and talk to my friends over Facebook about a party which I had been planning for that night. Nothing special, just a couple of drinks, scary movie or two, to celebrate the fact that it's Friday and I had the rest of the weekend to enjoy, because I still had Halloween fever. I always tried to remain social amongst my immediate circle of friends. Most of them I had already converted into die-hard horror fans. Some of them hadn't quite become comfortable with it, which also suited me. If you're not intrigued, you'd be scared, and that's what it's all about. I reached the patio doors at the front of the house, and just as I was about to find the front door key hidden with the rest of my keys, I spotted a package just inside the closed patio door. It was large, surrounded by brown paper and covered with 2 thin lines of white string, one horizontal, one vertical, meeting in the middle in a large knot. I didn't need to open it to know that by its dimensions, it was some kind of painting or poster, framed, as the outline of the paper suggested. It had a small note attached to it, which I picked up and read. Title: The Ragman. This should offer adequate material for a story. I was a little perplexed. It wasn't entirely unheard of for people to send ideas, objects, or pictures of a scary scenario to me. Normally it was done online, and it was almost always come with a name of the contributor so that they could have their names in the finished piece. But this trinket came with nothing of the sort. Not even a return address. Still, I was curious, so I took a look inside. After settling myself with a hot drink and taking my coat off, I undid the string that hid the mysterious picture underneath. As the brown paper fell from view, I was struck with the beautiful but haunting image that dwelled on the other side. It was a large painting, roughly 3 feet by 2. It depicted the edge of some kind of haunted woodland, on a mound encompassing the left portion of a painting, overlooking some kind of plantation-style house and surrounding land on the right. The plantation land was being toiled by laborers and landowners that watched on, drinking some kind of iced beverage, I assume, seemingly oblivious to a menacing and daunting, long-limbed, aberrant figure standing on the mound at the foreground to the left of the scene. He was wearing some kind of strange pinstriped, dark, and ragged suit that barely covered the base of each of his twisted limbs. His fingers extended, pointing towards the house in the distance. They seemed disproportionate to the rest of his strangely thin body. He had an odd hunch in his back, which facilitated a tear on the suit. He had badly worn shoes on his feet that were torn at the seams, much like the rest of his attire. And he pointed from the trees into the direction of the house in the distance, his face trapped in some kind of twisted laugh. His eyes were pale and white, giving some kind of deathly omen, and his smile stretched from one ear of his large head to the other, bearing gritty yellowish teeth. His long, dark hair streamed past his shoulders. He seemed to even absorb the color from his side of the picture, leaving the whole tree line melancholic with some deep sense of foreboding. This picture genuinely unnerved me. I put it down, propped it up against the wall, and examined it intimately, my eyes focusing on every detail, noticing that there was no date or artist's signature anywhere to be seen. I felt a chill up my spine, that cold sensation I had felt when I was frightened as a young boy. Whoever sent me the picture had indeed given me good material, and I thought to myself, bravo. I hung the picture up in the spare room downstairs, connected to the sitting room. It was originally a utility room that had been converted into a spare room by the landlord 2 years ago, right before I moved in. I would occasionally let a friend sleep in the room now, as I didn't have anyone else to share the rent with at the moment. The picture sat above the radiator, on the wall opposite the entrance to the room, so that it could be seen from the living room if you simply kept the door open. It would help with the inspiration. And later that night, one by one, my friends showed up. We partook in some drinks, put on a DVD in the background, not really paying attention, and discussed life in general, but we also discussed the gift that I had received at great length. The painting became the life of the party, as I mentioned it to everyone when they came in. People discussed the disturbing imagery in the painting, the fact that there was no name to take credit for the painting, and also the title. Like myself, none of them had ever heard of the Ragman. They all had their 2 cents on the art, and then requested that I keep the door closed for the rest of the party, which I did. It seemed a little too eerie for some. For a time afterwards, people threw ideas at me for what kind of story I should write with it. One of them thought that I should write about the plantation owner in a Civil War era, that the Ragman should be an avenging angel to get vengeance on the evil land baron for the cruelty to the slaves. One of them postulated that the Ragman could be a disfigured slave himself, his gaunt body having been tortured by the master of the house. I thought the best suggestion, however, was when someone mentioned that he should simply come out of the haunted forest for victims. That it should not be related to the fact that the man owned slaves. On the contrary, he should just show up out of the woods for the rich man's children. Stories are always scarier when they involve innocent children, I thought. Eventually, as the evening dwindled, people started to leave. The drinks and tiredness had gotten the better of them. I offered the room if anyone wanted to stay, but they all politely declined. Some of them said that they didn't want to get up in the morning and have to go then, and would instead leave now. Some said that they just preferred the comfort of their own bed, but I knew the real reason. The conversation about the painting had settled most of them. As the night came to a close, I walked the last guest to the door, an old friend of mine, Matt. He smelled like there was a thick blanket of beer surrounding him. I thought to myself that it was a good idea he wasn't driving. As I said my goodbyes, I asked one last time his opinion on my acquisition. "So what do you think of the picture?" He placed his hand up to his mouth as his response came with a slight burp that reeked of alcohol. "Very creepy," he said. "Gives me the chills. I hate the way he's just pointing at you with that messed up smile. Anyways, I gotta go. Good luck," he answered, fighting off another beer-soaked burp. I closed the door behind him, and I locked it. I began turning off the lights in the house, one by one, starting with the downstairs. I decided to leave the empty bottles of beer on the sitting room table until tomorrow morning, and I would have the energy to clean. I saw, from the lack of light under the doorway to the spare room, that the light had already been switched off, and I flicked the switch in the living room before making my way up to bed. One by one, I turned the lights off. The one in the downstairs hall, the one on the stairs. Bit by bit, the house was succumbing to the darkness of the winter night, culminating in the final switch for the landing at the top of the stairs. Then I entered my bedroom, took off my clothes apart from my t-shirt and my boxer shorts, turned off the final light in my room, and then got into bed. I decided to even leave brushing my teeth until the morning. After all, I had been drinking, and I didn't care about my dental hygiene. I just wanted to sleep more than anything. I lay there in the darkness for a few minutes, waiting for the grip of my dreams to hoist me to sleep, when a thought struck me. I felt that tingling down my spine, so much worse than before. and for the first time in years, I panicked as the thought of pure horror made me recoil under the covers like a child. Did Matt say the figure in the painting pointed outwards? Thoughts swam around my mind like a hungry shark. The figure in the painting, the Ragman, he pointed towards the plantation house. That much I was certain. I'd spent some time earlier studying every inch of that artistry, and was convinced that that's what I saw. Yet Matt, clear as day. I hate the way that he's just pointing at you with that messed up smile. My mind flooded with rational thoughts of how to explain that. He must have been mistaken. Perhaps the alcohol he had consumed had gotten the upper hand of his better judgment. I composed myself as I lay half under the covers. I laughed to myself, quietly, at that moment, dismissing my fears as flights of fantasy. Dreams of an old horror fan, looking for the attention his imaginary counterparts had received in the stories he had read his whole life. I lay there, still, for a time. All I could do was see the image of the picture in my mind. I studied it again and again in my head, and every time I regarded the painting, the figure near the woods, the Ragman, pointed at the plantation house. I knew I would not get any sleep with this notion itching at the back of my mind, so I decided to go downstairs to check the damnable picture myself. What's the worst that could happen? What's the worst that could happen? I have a haunted painting in my house, I thought to myself. Maybe it could be worth something. With this thought, I sat up and turned on the bedside lamp, which lay on the locker next to me. I uncovered myself and walked over to the light switch on the other end of the room, near the door. I flicked it on and proceeded out onto the landing. The cold air in the house tickled my skin in my disheveled state of undress, but that was the least of my concerns. I made my way downstairs, turning on all the other switches again in reverse order, till I was in the living room. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at the spare room door. It was strange, but I felt uneasy in that moment. All the experience I had with true terror, whether it was in the words of an author or the celluloid of a silver screen, now working against me, giving me a million reasons not to open the door. Perhaps there was a demonic entity on the other side. Perhaps there was a monstrous creature ready to devour my very soul and take me screaming into the pits of hell. Perhaps it was just a picture. I took a deep breath and opened the door. I was greeted with the dark room. On the wall, on the opposite end, hung the painting. Its features fogged and jaded, a mere silhouette in the pitch black. I flicked on the lights, expecting the outstretched arms of the devil himself to reach out from the framed menace on the wall, but instead it was just the opposite. A simple picture. I looked at it, squinting to capture all the details, and because of the sudden introduction of light into the room, I saw the figure indeed did point towards the front of the painting. Maybe I was wrong, I thought. It was hours ago. I didn't really look for that long. Must have simply been mistaken. I took one last glance at it as I switched off the light. It was more than at the front of the painting, that is. Long, bony, disproportionate fingers were pointing. They were pointing at me. I closed the door. Mere hours later is when things began to get interesting. I awoke from a deep sleep at 3:07 to the distant, rhythmic sound of tapping. My eyes weren't heavy. I wasn't still fighting the compunction to drift back to my dreams. I was fully aware, as if I hadn't slept at all. The tapping sound took all my focus. With the lack of light in the room, it seemed as though the strange sound was all that existed. Even in my state of complete awareness, it took several seconds to register the intrusion of my thoughts. I looked over at the time on the alarm clock on my bedside locker. Noticed it was just after 3. My mind studied the sound, which came every 2 seconds or so, in increments of 3 light-sounding knocks that determined that whatever was tapping was hitting against something wooden. It sounded too far away to be coming from my bedroom. If I cared to guess, I would have said it came from downstairs. I sat up in bed and turned on the bedside lamp. Sat there for a time in my tiny kingdom of light as I listened studiously to the tapping sound. I made my way downstairs again, against my instincts in an attempt to find the source. By the time I made it to the base of the stairs, the tapping stopped. I checked the whole floor, meticulously, after turning on all the lights, leaving the spare room to last, but I could not find where it had come from. I was somewhat hoping to confront the rational reason for the sound, but I couldn't decide if it was more frightening to let my imagination create the cause, or to find out the cause something else, something that was supernatural. I eventually went back to sleep, my answers unfulfilled. This happened to me at the same time. For the next few days, I would awaken to the tapping sounds from my sleep into a state of complete awareness, and it was always at the same time, always at 3:07. Most nights, I wouldn't even get out of bed, because I never found where it was coming from. But I knew. I didn't want to believe it, but deep in the depths of my soul, I knew where it came from. After a while, I eventually had to admit defeat with the painting. I decided to devote myself to investigating its origins in great detail, and I took the sheet from the bed in the spare room and draped it over the picture. It had declared war, and now I was going to delve into the rabbit hole and see what I could find. I decided I wouldn't tell my friends about the foulness that had befallen me. The last thing I wanted was them mocking me. They would just say that I was getting what I deserved, searching for ghosts and other entities, only to find one. Not exactly a surprise. I could already hear their jeers. I spent the next 2 weeks looking for some clues to the origins of the painting, or a history behind the story of the Ragman, but to no avail. And something really strange happened. I woke from a deep sleep, 3:07, to the distant, rhythmic sound of tapping. It was early morning of November 28th, Sunday. I lay there in my bed, as usual, sound of tapping goading me to come and search for it, attempting to spur me into action. As I lay there, observing the thin rays of moonlight that breached their confines into the otherwise dreary dark bedroom, my eyes began to become accustomed to the lack of light. More and more the room came into focus, the tapping in the distant corner of the house, mocking my attempts at rest. I was getting agitated with the unwelcome disturbances. They seemed tame at this point. I mean, a horror story about a man who was annoyed by a tapping sound was not enough in itself. I was starting to get bored with the antics at this point. Then, I heard a loud crash. The unmistakable sound of falling wood from downstairs. Sudden, thundering ruction echoed within the entire house, causing me to sit bolt upright. The adrenaline took control and prepared my body to flee as fast as my muscles would physically allow. The bone-chilling thunderclap was followed by a slightly quieter sound of a similar nature, indicating that something had indeed fallen downstairs. It was obvious that it was the painting. That was the way my mind worked now. Something went wrong, it was the painting. I composed myself momentarily, got out of bed to confront whatever the sound maker was. It was becoming second nature now, turning on the lights in the house to check the darkened corners, to peer into the hidden vestiges of my house of horrors. It was a nerve-wracking time indeed, but this night was different. The tapping was low and agitated. Much like the noise didn't want to wake me, Rather, just to know that something was there. This was different. This was aggressive and violent. Made my way into the living room, stared at the spare room door, gathered the courage that I had inside me, and I opened it. As I stood there, I gazed into the gloom and noticed that the window next to the bed was open. The window from outside was blowing the curtains wildly, their fabric fighting against the gust as if a desperate attempt to stay attached to the window frame. I felt the cold breeze, since I was only in my boxer shorts and t-shirt again. I shuddered for a moment. The painting was lying on the floor, underneath its designated hanging place. Its back facing me, and the sheet was lying on the ground next to it. I uttered my annoyance at the open window, thinking that my lack of sleep, I left it open at some point. I was making a habit these days of going to the room occasionally to check that the sheet still covered the picture. Some ominous force hadn't removed it. I walked over to the window, made an attempt to close it, jamming the wooden frame down hard. It stuck halfway and required more force, but eventually I got it closed. Stepped over the sheet, strewn across the floor. I picked up the picture, turning it over in the process. My eyes widened as a sickening shot of fear ran all the way down my spine, causing all the hairs to stand on the back of my neck, making my limbs go numb, my whole mind shut down out of terror. I dropped the painting and fell straight backward into a seated position, forgetting the pain of falling as my arms lay behind me to keep me up, staring at the picture intently with a newfound horror I could barely keep contained. I was afraid to break eye contact from the picture which lay diagonally facing me. In all its malice, empty of the Ragman. I lay there motionless as I realized that everything about the painting was just as it had always been, but in place of the figure on the left side was an empty mound. My eyes took a few seconds to process this earth-shattering information. The mound on the left of the picture, where the Ragman had been standing, watching the door to the spare room, was no longer in the picture. How had this happened? Was the picture truly haunted? How could this be? Where was he? That last question was the most disturbing. After looking at the void in the painting for this extended time, I noticed something else that was equally disturbing. One of the trees that lay on the outskirt of the wood, more specifically the tree that the Ragman's right hand was on as he pointed outwards, had another feature. Scratches of some kind. No, not scratches. Etchings. From weeks of tapping against it every night. At least that's how I perceived it. I got up from the floor with an unbalanced flare of a man running for his life. I left the room, leaving the painting lying where it had fallen, and closed the door behind me. I flew into the living room, desperate to get away, to go anywhere but here. I bumped into the table in the living room with force and fell in a heap on the floor, pain searing through my leg as I caught my shin bone on the edge of the table. I was only down for seconds before I staggered upwards, heading straight for the living room door. A loud, powerful, devilish cackle filled the air, coming straight from the room that I had left in such a terrified hurry. My senses were in full alert as I ran into the hallway, screaming in white-knuckle terror. The laugh began to die off as I got further from the spare room. I didn't dare look back, instead of running for the front door. I fumbled with the handle as I attempted to open it. The cackle then started to get progressively louder, as whatever was making the sound was seemingly getting closer to me. I was too afraid to look back, too scared that it might be my last time if I did. My mind attempted to prompt me, my terrible thoughts, feigning the feeling that something was touching the back of my neck, causing my muscles to tense at the thought and my mouth to emit a horrified scream. I realized in that moment that the door was locked, as it always had been, and that the keys were upstairs. I slumped to the ground, sobbing. With as much courage as I could scrape from inside me, I turned back to look down the hall in the direction of the living room door. down towards the ever-increasing laugh. Then nothing. No evil demon. No wretched, horrible creature. No Ragman. Needless to say, I didn't sleep that night. I certainly didn't try in that house. I went to a motel, leaving the place locked up just the way that it was when all that happened. I didn't even put the painting back up. That night, I just stayed in the motel with my laptop, checking my friend's Facebook profile to see if anyone mentioned anything similar happening to them, but there was nothing. I returned to the house the next day, under the protection of daylight. I decided to take another sick day off work. The restless nights meant that I didn't have the energy some days to go in. I nearly used up all my payable sick days, but at this point it was for a worthy cause. I unlocked the front door and walked into the house. On outside inspection, you wouldn't have thought that anything had gone wrong in the house at all. I walked down towards the hall, towards the sitting room, and entered. I felt a sudden chill at the sight of the open spare room door and the fallen picture that lay opposite. I could see, even from the sitting room doorway, the figure of the Ragman had returned to the painting. I walked over for a closer inspection. It seemed as though it was all there, as it was the day I received it. The figure was there, the trees had returned to normal. I was both relieved and confused. I made my decision that I would stay in the house again that night, but this time I was going to set up cameras around the house. If horror movies had taught me anything, it was that you need proof, lest you be branded a lunatic. Spent most of the day procuring all the equipment I could to record anything that would happen in the house that night. I had some of it already, being an avid fan of films. I can't say that the rest didn't cost me a pretty penny, but I was eager to catch that thing inside my house. I felt a little safer at the thought of all the corners being watched, but still, the more time that passed that day, the darker it got as it reached night, the more I felt uneasy. The longer that I spent in that house, the more I felt supernatural eyes watching my every move, waiting for me to fall asleep. Roughly midnight, I did. I awoke from a deep sleep at 3:07 to the distant, rhythmic sound of tapping. This time, I was ready though. I was already dressed before the clock turned to 3:07. I already had the lights in the house on, so the cameras could catch everything, no matter how brief or small. I went down the stairs and into the living room. As I reached the door, the tapping sound disappeared. I opened the door to look in. The spare room had been left open. The picture returned to where it had been these past few weeks. The sheet had been removed just to see if what had happened before would repeat itself. There was a mounted camera on a tripod behind the living room table, facing the open spare room door. A light at the side of the camera shone into the direction of the room, and the light in the sitting room was on to catch whatever would be in there. When I opened the door and looked in, I saw the painting hung up where I had left it after I prepared all the cameras. Absent the Ragman. It stood there staring at me, the mound empty, the plantation house alone, the trees free of their friend who had been terrorizing me. Let out a quiet wail, out of shock. I began to cower, reaching for a wall behind me so that I could not be ambushed. The tapping sound returned, and this time it was accompanied by the sound of laughter. I don't know how I knew. There was no way, but I felt that the laughter was sarcastic, as if I had angered him and he was laughing at my failed attempt, my attempt to make him look the fool. The laughter resonated throughout the house, but I was close enough to discern its origin. It was coming from the kitchen. I mustered up all my available courage and slowly moved towards the dining room. Then the kitchen. I could hear the sound of pots and cups banging against the counters, as if someone was having a tantrum. The laughter was sickeningly twisted. As I reached the side of the open kitchen, I closed my eyes and reached out with my fingers so I could drag the rest of my barely willing body to look inside the room. I peered around the corner and saw it. The Ragman stood in the kitchen, throwing dishes around as it flailed. Its long limbs I determined to be about 3 times the length of mine, and its thin frame towered at least 12 feet tall. It was hunched over and its knees were bent, so it couldn't stand upright in the room. It moved, energetically but violently, knocking over all the cutlery it could see in an anarchistic trashing frenzy, its laugh occasionally turning into a growl as it moved its arms in a feral motion. And then it turned and looked straight at me. I was frozen in terror, and for just a second I didn't realize that almost half of me was visible as I was peeking around the corner. It looked into my eyes, and as I stuttered in dumbfounded disbelief, it was only as the hunched figure frantically ran towards me that my instincts took over and I attempted to flee, my voice uttering an automatic howl of desperate fear. There were crashing sounds as Furniture tossed around the dining room, and its excessively long legs made running meaningless. I felt an icy cold hand grip my shoulder and spin me around. My eyes were jammed shut as long, nimble fingers wrapped around my throat. I was hoisted up against the wall like a rag doll. I heard the laughter, mere inches from my face. I felt its breath against my cheek. I opened my eyes and looked at it then. Noticed its unnaturally large face, pale skin, and its deeply disturbing, incomprehensibly evil eyes. Its smile extended to impossible proportions. It spoke in a loud, gravelly, guttural voice, which shook me to my core.
It's rude not to answer me.
I simply stared, dumbstruck by its immense stature and the ease at which it was holding me off the ground. My arms held in its hand as it kept me against the wall. My attempts to break from the grip were futile, and then it spoke again.
You are meant to ask who's there.
I stared at it. For a moment, I had forgotten that it was pinning me against the wall, and with the greatest of ease, it could snap my neck. I pondered what it was saying to me, and although the words together made sense, I still didn't understand what in the world it was talking about. I simply looked at it, puzzled.
After all, I've been knocking for weeks now.
Then it laughed with a raging force that shook my whole body, and I screamed loud and hard. The room began to spin, and I became dizzy as the overflow of impossible information started to weigh my thoughts down, and I slipped into unconsciousness. The laughter echoed in my mind until the darkness swept over me, and I was consumed by nothingness. Sounds flooded my skull, faded and distant. And then I opened my eyes. It took me a moment to realize that I was lying on the dining room floor, and there was no sign of the Ragman. I sat up against the wall. My attention was caught by the shards of plastic strewn about the floor and the bent sticks of metal. It took me a few moments to figure out that the shrapnel that was lying on the dining room floor, sharing the space with me, was the remnants of the camera equipment that I had set up. I knew without thorough examination that there was nothing left that could be construed as tangible evidence of the supernatural. I felt alone and defeated. I felt that there was nothing I could do. I gripped my knees as I sat there, leaning against the wall. I cried for just a moment. I stood up and gathered my will. I marched into the spare room beyond the living room, and I grabbed the painting off the wall. I couldn't tell you if the figure was back or not, because quite frankly, at that moment, I simply didn't care. Without a second thought, I broke the frame and tore the canvas within into pieces. The pieces I placed in the fire and then burned them. I then walked upstairs and got dressed to leave the house. I had the eerie suspicion that I was being watched. More than that, it felt like there was always something in my peripherals, just shy of sight, waiting to grab me. There was 1,000 eyes on me at all times, that I was alone. I grabbed my keys and my laptop. I left the house, lights on and all. I'd had enough of that place. I got in my car and drove away. I didn't know where I was going, only that I was going as far away as I could. The entire journey I spotted things in the shadows, things that weren't there. I was jumping at every sound, just waiting to be ambushed. I passed through the looking glass and now existed in a world where everything was possible. I felt that everything that we knew as a species was meaningless, that there was an entire multitude of worlds beneath the surface of ours. I knew that I would never be the same after that night. Now that we're at the end of our story, I can tell you the conclusion. This is where you come in. You see, I went to a motel room that night again, and I spent hours, and I mean hours, searching for any details on the Ragman. I needed to know what it wanted, and what I should do to rid myself of its torment. Well, the good news is, I eventually did find it. I stumbled across the old Grimm's Brothers tales of the Ragman. It turns out there's a very simple way to escape his clutches and save yourself from becoming one of his victims. You see, the Ragman is a tale of an entity that thrives on the fear of young children. If you want to rid yourself of the fear, you simply tell one of your friends. You tell them every detail of the horror that the Ragman puts you through and let it fester within them. Ragman is effectively a tale of ghost story tag, until eventually, the last one cannot find someone new to tell, and the Ragman reaches out to them in the depths of their nightly slumbers to make them his. That's what the painting was about. Someone must have had a problem with me, or just knew that I would be attracted to the horror material like that and purge themselves of the horror of the Ragman. Didn't work on my friends either, because I can't have passed on someone else's story. You need to tell it yourself. That must be why it did not appreciate the cameras in the house. So I've stayed up for as long as possible, just writing out this story, trying to put in all the details that I can, trying to paint you a picture of what the Ragman was like for me. I have deliberately tried to terrify you, frighten you, even intrigue you slightly. That's all I need. Just enough for you to think about him for a brief moment. Tag, you're it. Okay, the ending freaked me out. I don't like that. I don't like that one bit. I don't do well with like supernatural stuff. Oh man. Well, if this is my last upload, you know why. That was that was really good. Um yeah, that was really good. I am so thoroughly freaked out. I'm like looking over my shoulder every 5 seconds during this recording. I liked it a lot. I'm not going to say anything about it, you know. Yeah, good story. Um once it got to like the whole he was 12 foot tall and like his arms were twice the length of a human's, like to me that was like, oh, that's just cool. Like I stopped being freaked out for a second, but then it got back to like the more supernatural, like all you have to do is think about it, like it's like a cognitive hazard. I don't like that at all. That freaks me out. That like supernatural stuff I do not do well with. That's why I love creature horror. That's why Skinwalker is so cool to me, because it's like, yeah, it's like almost unbeatable, but it's still beatable. That's like, yeah, there's nothing you can do. You just have to pass it on to someone else. So, super freaky. Didn't like that. I just realized I'm still recording. Yeah, I'm like scared to leave my closet now. uh, Note to self: do not record these right before bed anymore. Anyway, um, yeah, I'm gonna go read my Bible now. On that note, hope you all have a great evening, morning, or afternoon, depending on when you're watching this. God bless, May the Lord protect you and keep you. May his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. And yeah, have a great day. Or again, whenever you watch this, have a good time. I'm just rambling. All right, see ya.